welcome back to the Speak Up Erika podcast. I'm your host, Erika, and this podcast talks about things that we're scared to talk about but should. I'm here with Rosemary and Kendra. Hi. Awesome. We have Rosemary, who is an author of The Girl on Harlow Street, and also Kendra is her editor. If you two can both introduce yourselves, Rosemary, if you'd like to start.
Yeah, hi. So my name is Rosemary Davison, and I'm the author of The Girl on Harlow Street. This is a serial novel which I ran on a website for its first run. I don't want to call it a rough copy because I did work quite hard on that. And now it's about to do a second run on Patreon. So I've been working on this novel for about 4 years now. And Erika, thank you for having me. And Kendra, thanks for joining me here on the podcast.
Yeah, so exciting for you to be able to relaunch your book and have its official launch, which is going to be coming up in November the 6th, and we'll have definitely more details about that after as well. Great to have you here, Rosemary.
Thank you.
Yeah, and Kendra, would you like to introduce yourself as well?
Sure. I'm Kendra Goodalene. I'm Rosemary's editor. I joined The Girl on Harlow Street about over a year ago, and I have been working with Rosemary ever since and have been helping with the final draft that we've put on Patreon and just making sure that everything is cohesive, and we've been working on all of the different aspects of the novel, and it's really shaped up into something really amazing.
Yeah, that's so exciting. And could you tell us, Rosemary, or even Kendra, if you'd like to add on about what is The Girl on Harlow Street?
Yeah, well, it's a very big novel, and the only way that I feel I could have tackled a novel of that size is to do it in a serial format. The Victorian component is pretty large to it, and publishing chapters weekly in a newspaper was a Victorian tradition. So that tradition worked out very well in terms of theme, but also for practicality's sake in getting a novel that large done. It is a really dense book, but it deals with a police officer in modern day England who is in a difficult time of his life. He's got lots of health problems. He's approaching middle age, problems at home, problems in his marriage, and he's called to the scene of a suicide. A young woman has ended her life, and he is one of the officers on the scene for that death. And this particular situation, it's decided that it's a suicide, and as devastated as Phil, this police officer, is, he puts it behind him. And then a few days later, a large manuscript arrives at the police station. And it's a manuscript that was written by this woman who's ended her life. And Phil is tasked to read this manuscript and see whether it sheds any light on Aubrey Holloway, that's the name of the young woman, on her death. And as he gets into this, it is a story about the Victorian ancestors that were living in the house where she ended her life. And as he gets into this mammoth manuscript, he begins to see himself. He begins to identify with the things that the characters are going through. And it really helps him on his personal journey, but he also gets to the bottom of why, Aubrey Holloway has died. So that's the book in a nutshell, but that's a simplification of it because it is a very long saga.
Yes, and could you tell us, I know previously we talked to Rosemary that there are different themes that are in the book. Can you kind of mention those as well?
Yeah, absolutely. So because the premise of the book is suicide, definitely mental health is a main theme. I look at mental health issues in modern day and also in the 70s. I think that's still modern day for a lot of us, and in Victorian times. So that's definitely a strong thread. Life after death, reincarnation, transcendence of of time and place to connect with people who have passed on and to connect with people in the future. What else? It's what I like to call a life story. It sort of has everything in life. I can't really classify it as one genre because it is a murder mystery, and it's a romance and a comedy and a tragedy, and it's erotic literature, and it's all of that stuff wrapped up into one story. Definitely about art, about censorship, about the fight to be creative in a world and in a society which intentionally and unintentionally stifles, and that definitely plays into the sexual thread as well. It's about a journey for self-expression, and that again, we're going to talk about sexuality today, but it applies to both art and sex in this story. So yeah, lots of themes in this book.
Yes, I think me and you, Rosemary, we both connected with each other because of the whole mental health aspect as well, which is really near and dear to me, and I know for you as well. Going off of the theme of sexuality and art, I guess I have a question to kind of kick off our discussion for today, and it is, what are some of the expectations with sex and being a woman? If both you and Kendra are more than welcome to answer.
Kendra, I'll let you take that one first.
Sure. I mean, one of my favorite parts of the novel was that it covers so much ground in all of the different generations of the people that it follows, in Victorian times, in modern times. Again, like Rosemary said, in the 70s as well, you get all these different ages where characters are influenced by their times that they live in. You see all of the different ways in which society, and specifically the approach to feminism and sexuality, has evolved over time. And you see how each character evolves with the times around them and how they interact with expectations of sexuality upon them. Namely, in the Victorian part of the novel, we see a character, Justine, struggle with all of the different ways in which men are opposing her freedom of speech, her freedom to write, and her freedom of expression in her sexuality. And she's such a strong character. And the theme of her gaining her agency through her sexuality in the Victorian period is something that recurs throughout the novel, and that really drew me to the story. And that you can see, even though it's in modern times now, you see the effects of her feminism throughout history, and then staying true in her ancestors generations later. I think that was one of my favorite aspects of sexuality, that it was not just something that was experienced by one generation, that we see with all of the different waves of feminism, it evolves over time and it influences the modern day. And that's how we got to where we are today.
Yeah, and just to add to that, I think a measuring stick for this is in terms of, women and sexuality and sexual expression, is just how difficult it was for me to fight the fear and write like this. If you think about it, it's 2021, and I started this in 2019, and I was writing before 2019. But all the way along, I was fighting my own fear about writing sexually and writing sexually explicit material. And that tells you something. There's so much of it out there, and there's so much of it out there that's more explicit than what I'm writing. But yet here I am, I'm having to take a deep breath before I push post on those chapters. And that in itself, just my own fear and overcoming that gives you an idea that at least my perception is that we do not live in a society which is sexually free and judgment free. And certainly, in my own circles, lots of worry about what people will think. And yeah, so I think it's very difficult to sexually express yourself in writing or in art or any way if you in this society without being worried about some sort of criticism or judgment.
I think also on that note, Rosemary, it was so interesting to see how the novel is posed as quite literary. There's a lot of themes and there's a lot of merit to a lot of the themes that are running throughout the novel. And it just goes to show how little people think of novels if there's like a hint of eroticism or any kind of explicit writing. They automatically write it off as genre fiction, which is frowned upon, or something that's less interesting or less literary, or something that's a bit more fluffy. When why is that? Your writing is perfectly poetic, and just because we mention something that's a little bit more explicit than maybe what we're used to, certainly doesn't take away from its merit.
Well, you've studied, English literature, and I've studied English literature. And pretty soon you will be more educated in English literature than me. But you know that even in ancient literature, even in, literature from the Middle Ages or Shakespearean literature, there is lots of explicit material. There's lots of crude material. And today I took some time to do a little bit of research before this podcast, because there's definitely things that I allude to in the novel. And when I was doing that, I wasn't, I kind of write without thinking. And then after the fact, I look at what I've done, and it's like, oh yeah, that's why I did that. I can see what I've done. But today I did a little bit of reading on Chaucer. So writing in the Middle Ages in England, I can remember studying, Geoffrey Chaucer at university, and the crudest material is in his, Canterbury Tales. Shakespeare, I think of A Midsummer Night's Dream and the subplot happening there. There's, sort of this body, subplot happening. And then, and I do this in the novel for sure. I have one of the characters do her rendition of a sermon on the Song of Solomon. And the Song of Solomon in the Old Testament is extremely erotic. It's also one of the most poetic books. And yet, in all my life, I've never heard anyone, give a talk on it or preach on it. It just seems to be skipped over. And yet it's so beautiful and it's so graphic. And it is about physical love in marriage. And yet nobody ever talks about it. So, but it's there, it's there in the Old Testament. Explicit material is in, our literary heavyweights, in the past. And I'm really interested to see how, my writing is received. So while I'm nervous, I'm also pretty excited, but I'm also really curious, like, how's it going to be received?
That's awesome, Rosemary. And I know you're talking about kind of like sexuality in art and how that's different from kind of how people perceive what you were saying, Kendra, of like people writing about explicit material. Can you kind of dive in more about what makes your writing different from kind of what people may expect like pornography to be written as?
Mm-hmm. Everybody is going to have a different definition of what pornography is. So pornography for one person might be something completely different than what it is for another person. So I can imagine that there will be some people out there that would, read some of my scenes and think, oh, that's pornographic. So for me, when you consider mainstream pornography, it's sexual experience isolated. And I know when we did the practice, I joked around a bit. I mean, the biggest context that you might get is the pizza man showing up to the door and, something like that. But there's not really too much of a story around it. It's isolated sexual experience. And my feeling is that there's so much of that, and I'm not going to pass judgment on it, but I don't want to add to it. I want to do something that's a little bit different. And so all of my writing and all of that explicit writing is very contextualized. So it's usually in a meaningful relationship. And I don't mean necessarily like a healthy relationship, because a meaningful relationship doesn't have to necessarily be a good one. But you always have it happening within this big context, and the context itself starts to feed that experience. And when I was writing my notes for this beforehand, I was thinking like the context that I give the sexual experience has all this sort of threads that lead into that sexual experience. And I like to think of that, they're like nerve endings, and they kind of like spark the experience. And if you take all the context away, then you're sort of just left with this lump of an experience, but without all the other stuff that can heighten it and that can give meaning to it. So for example, if you have a sex scene coming after a really intense fight, then that sex scene or that sex is going to be a release of tension. If it's coming as part of a farewell, it's going to be fraught with sadness. If it is coming in a situation where it's in a marriage and the husband feels it's his right to have sex with his wife and he's not listening to her nose, then that sex is going to be a completely different situation than it would be if it was healthy and charged. And so I'm very, very interested in the context around it, and I think that probably, I would say, separates it from the mainstream pornography. And then the other thing is I'm very interested in sex as a context in and of itself. So and I'm referring to some notes that I wrote before this podcast. But if you look at a flower and you appreciate the flower and you think, what, the flower, that's such a beautiful flower, and that's great, you're just appreciating it for what it is, and that's fine and it's wonderful. Once you start to look at what's happening scientifically within the flower, all the different parts moving together, then you move from sort of appreciation to awe. You move into, wow, that's a bit of a miracle. And this is going to sound really over the top and romantic, but I am interested in looking at what's happening in the sexual act. And then there's one scene in particular where I take, chemistry, biology, geography, music, and I work it into the language, mathematics, so with the angles, and so that you see all the disciplines and how in a figurative, literal and figurative way they play into that scene. So I don't know. I mean, I don't think I'm an expert on mainstream pornography, but I would say that I would think that these things that I'm talking about set my writing apart from it.
Yeah, that's beautiful. Thank you for sharing, Rosemary. And I know you also mentioned about the music. Can you kind of also talk about how, like, you have music in The Girl on Harlow Street and also illustrations, and kind of how does everything tie in together with all of the artistic elements with your writing?
So do you want me to talk about that generally in the novel, or specifically to the explicit writing?
I know Kendra asked a really good question yesterday about like the music and the art. I don't remember what the question was. I don't know if you would want to re-say that, Kendra. Do you know which one I was talking about or referring to?
I can't remember exactly which question, but I know a lot of interdisciplinary practices come into play in the story, and I think that the music is just part of the sexual experience as well. You see a lot of these recurring episodes. Specifically with Phil, it's another part of the episodes that recur with the resurgence of those who came before him in the past. So maybe musicality is another way in which that generational trauma and that history is coming through, like how sexuality does as well. What do you think, Rosemary?
Okay, so I'm thinking, because I do use music a lot personally, when I'm writing. Okay, so let's just isolate it with the explicit writing for a moment.
Okay, sounds good.
So often I will write those scenes to music, not always, but quite a bit. And I will use the rhythm of the music to mimic the rhythm of the language. The reader isn't going to know that. They're just going to read the scene, and they might notice. And that's one thing that really drew me to Kendra is, she, because of her dance background, I think, she was the first person to pick up on that. She goes, I've noticed that there's a rhythm to the sentences, that you choose your words really carefully to make sure that you're maintaining rhythm. And I was like really thrilled because no one had detected that. And that's true, that I write to music. And so that I can, have that rhythm. And I think that there is a rhythm to music. There's a rhythm to sex. There's a rhythm to your heartbeat. There's a rhythm to breathing. It is the rhythm of life. And, for me, the whole sort of sexual writing, the sexual act is almost like a parallel, or not even a parallel, but it is the beat. It's the life beat. Same as our breath, same as our heartbeat. And you find that in music all the time. And so, yeah, the music. So that's, I would say, how it applies to that. Every so often, I'll have Phil, the modern day character, because I know people listening won't have read the story. When he's reading the Victorian manuscript and he's reading one of those scenes, he'll say, wow, that scene would go great to this song. And I'll state the song. And I've written the scene to that song, right? And so to get my message across, just because I like to play with the reader a little bit, I'm kind of hoping that who's ever reading it is then going to go, look up the song and listen to it and read the scene to see whether, they can feel, what I felt when I was writing it. So I do have that modern character, because he has a soundtrack, he's always putting scenes to music, do that. So that's how it applies to this topic of the podcast. But in general, I feel that when you're trying to solve a problem, any problem, that you have to look out. I kind of hate the expression "look outside the box," because what box? It's just, to me, it's just sort of a silly expression. But you have to look at all different sort of solutions and all different things to solve problems. So, for example, and this is very lighthearted, so I'm not talking about major trauma here, but if I am stressed, I cook, I listen to music, I create music, I write, I walk, I meditate. There may be traditional therapy in there as well, but I do all kinds of things. Like there's not one thing that I'm doing to sort of kill my stress. And this is on a really innocent level, right? Because of course, with deep problems, you need to use still a whole bunch of problem solving techniques, but some heavy weights in there as well. So the music comes into play along with the art, in that the problems or the clues to solving this mystery aren't just in the text of the story. I want the reader to look outside of the text. There are clues in the music. There is a clue in every single illustration. There's several mysteries, in the story. But as a reader, you're going to, or a listener or a viewer of the artwork by Christine Kilfoyle, you're going to have to look outside of the writing to find the solutions to the story. And that for me is a mirror for what I would encourage people to do in real life. That the answers aren't always where you think they are. And music is one of the places in this story where there are some clues to the end result. So I don't know if that answers your question, but that's how music comes into it.
No, yes, it did answer the question. Thank you, Rosemary. And I know that aside from the music, you also talk about like the illustrations, which also gives us a visual of the environment that you're trying to portray in those scenes. Can you also like share a little bit more about the environment that you create when writing about like the sexual scenes as well?
For the illustrations, this is sort of more of a practical thing before we talk about the environment.
Mm-hmm.
You know, because you've asked me about the illustrations. In Victorian novels for grown-ups, they would have illustrations peppered throughout, not an illustrated novel or like you would see in a children's book, but little scenes sort of dotted throughout a big novel. And I thought that that would be great because we've got this big Victorian section to do that, but to modernize it by having those illustrations digital. Now, Christine, the illustrator, gave me a choice. She says I can paint them or I can do them digitally or sketch. So she did at the very, very beginning, she gave me a choice. And we decided to go with the digital because then she can change them and she can tweak them a lot more easily than if she's painting by hand. So I just thought that that was a really great thing to do, to give it, to take an old tradition, give it a modern twist, just the same way as I had by taking that old, you know, publish a chapter weekly in the newspaper, give it a modern twist by putting it on a website. And then I also think that it injects into the story a little bit of a, I want to say younger person vibe. It, to me, by having a young person do digital illustration for a novel set in Victorian times brings a youthfulness to it. But I have to say an 18+ youthfulness to it. So yeah, and I'm so happy with these illustrations. I think that they add another component, and then that becomes another part of the book, or I say book because it's digital, but another part of the story that I can then use to insert clues and things like that. So that's on the illustration. So the physical environment to me is something that I pay attention to because I mean, and again, before this podcast, I was thinking, you know, this whole story is about reconnecting. It's about, you know, coming out of disconnect from whatever tragedy or trauma or just, you know, everyday life that you've gone through, and reconnecting with yourself, with others, with the past, with your art, with your dreams. It's quite a hopeful story for me as a writer, but we are connected to our environments, and for good and for bad. And I think a lot of times that goes unnoticed. But if you're writing a scene like that, again, it's about looking beyond the obvious. So again, I don't know, but like, let's say you could take a situation where a writer is just describing, I don't want to say just describing the act, the sex act, or if it's a love sexual act, you know, no matter what the act is, and they just focus on the bodies of the two people. Well, I want to sort of broaden the vision with that and look at what's around them. So very often I bring the environment into the act itself. So for example, I will, you know, draw your attention to the floorboards, or, you know, shoulder blades sort of like against the floorboards, or the light coming through a window, or, you know, a patch of light on the floor, the walls, if they're outside, the shadows, the shade, it all becomes part of it. And I don't just describe it, I actually have it as if it's a participant. So one instance that I do this, and this was experimental, and I'm kind of smiling inside because this was one of Kendra's favorite scenes. But a reader said to me that's physically impossible to do. So maybe it's physically impossible to do, but I was experimenting, and Kendra really liked it. And I was also having this discussion with her. Okay, so I've had this criticism. Shall we keep this scene in here, or shall I get rid of it? Because it was experimental writing, and Kendra said, no, I think we should keep that scene in. So it looks like it will be in, but it is a scene with a chair. And so you've got sort of an empty room, and you've got a chair in the middle, and you've got the two lovers, and they're on the chair. And what I'm attempting to do is to write a ménage à trois as the chair as the third participant. So this is a real challenge, because the chair is an inanimate, object. And that's another thing. When I'm writing these scenes, like even in my life in general, I like a challenge. Like I don't want to say I don't do easy. I want a mental challenge, and I'm looking for a mental challenge. So I look at the chair, and the first thing I do is, what parts of the chair share the same language that the human body does? Okay, so we've got legs, we've got arms, we've got a back. So I can use those words. Then I look at the chair and I think, okay, what movement can a chair do that a human can do? Well, it can shift, it can shake, it can fall on its knees, it can fall on its back. So then I'm starting to look at verbs, and I've looked at the nouns that we share, then I've looked at the verbs, and then I think, yes, I can write a scene, and I can bring this inanimate object to life, and I can make it the third participant. So let's say she reached out and grabbed its arms, it fell on its knees. And, for me, at the end of that scene, and I will say I wrote that scene to silence, no music whatsoever, because I really wanted to focus on, I don't know why I wrote it to silence, but I think I wrote it to silence because I just wanted to focus on the rhythm of the words themselves to get that across. Now, for me, at the end of it, I thought it was a beautiful scene. I hope Kendra still thinks it's a beautiful scene. I'm gonna put it in there, even if physically it's impossible, because at the same time, this is a story, and it's got this sort of fantastical thread to it. So what if people can't do this? The fact is that that scene is supposed to be a piece of art, but that would be an example of where I'm using environment to participate in the scene. Another thing that I was thinking, and this is with the clothing, because the clothing isn't exactly environment, but the clothing I will have also participate in a scene. From a practical level, clothing is or accessories are super important. So let's say, once you get me talking on this, I will go. Like, I really, I like writing like that, and I like talking about it. So if you have a pendant on a character, and of course my main Victorian character is called Justine for people who haven't read, and she's not wearing anything, but she has that pendant. I can then use that pendant to show you how her body is moving. It becomes another vehicle for me. So for example, if the shadow, if the pendant is swaying over its shadow on the floor, you know what position she's in. If that pendant is brushing up against the chin of her lover, you know what position she's in. If the light comes through the window and hits that pendant and casts a ray over the body of the lover, you would all of a sudden, this one object becomes it becomes a huge vehicle to show you what's happening without showing you what's happening. And so for me, the environment, or I know the pendant's not an environment, but it's an extra thing beyond the bodies of the lovers. It just it's just, for me, it's like a writer's dream.
Yeah, it adds another level of participation. And I think that was one of the most interesting parts of the novel as well. It kind of brings into question who's participating in certain acts, especially if the story itself is written in a context where there's that sexual aspect as you're reading it. Do you, as the reader, partake in it in some way?
Do you want me to address that?
I don't know if it is it a question with a solid answer. I don't even know.
Well, this is one of, I don't know, again, it's a theme that really fascinates me, is the relationship between the reader and the writer. Really, really interests me. And again, you'll know from my notes and from our discussion that this novel deals with readers and writers, and it deals with Justine doing her explicit writing and readers reading it. The two men that she truly loves, do read this sort of writing. I think her husband does at one point, and he's really angry, but for the most part, her readers are people who appreciate this about her. But yeah, so what we talked about in the meeting and in the notes is that if somebody is writing that way, when they are writing that way, if they are doing a good job, they would have to be sexually charged. I had this wonderful writing mentor in the past, and he said to me, Rosemary, if you are laughing when you're writing a funny scene, chances are your reader is going to be laughing as well. If you are crying when you're writing a sad scene, your reader is going to be crying as well, or they're going to feel it. If you don't feel it, then how is your reader going to feel it? And he was such a good teacher. He would actually go through my writing and say, you weren't feeling this because I'm not feeling this. He goes, this is empty. He goes, this is empty. He goes, you're describing what's happening in terms of the action, but I'm not getting the emotion. And then he would say to me, so were you feeling that when you wrote it? And I would say, no, actually I wasn't. I couldn't feel what I was writing. So in that particular writing lesson, we stayed clear of anything sexual. But if you take that rule or that sort of truth that you have to feel what you're writing, well, when the writer's writing those scenes, of course they're turned on. How could they not be? Because they have to have that energy to pump it into the fiction, into the scene. Then if the reader at the other end is reading it and they pick up on that energy and the work is doing its job, that reader will be aroused while they're reading that scene, the same as they would be if they were, watching an explicit scene in a film. And so you have this exchange of sexual energy, which is taking place between the reader and the writer. It defies the barriers of time and space. And it's not classified as being unfaithful. Clearly, it could be by some people, but it's not. And I think it's up for readers to decide whether that's okay or whether that's not okay. But I think it would be really funny if somebody was reading the writing, and I don't want to make it personal, but let's say I've written a scene like that, and I've pumped it full of sexual energy, and the person on the other end feels it and they're aroused just a little bit. And then they say, oh my God, that writing is terrible. Like, that's so immoral. That's so, well, I mean, my reaction would be, A, don't read it. And second of all, if it's so immoral, well, then on a human level, it stimulated you to a degree. So I think that's really interesting, about what's okay and what's not okay. I think in this novel, you do have what we could call like a psychological affair. I mean, it's a real one in a way, but there's also, the couple physically consummate the relationship, but there's a psychological affair. And I think a lot of people would say, well, that's wrong. But at the same time, the reader and the writer in that dynamic of this back and forthing of sexual energy, or the transmission of sexual energy through print, through art to the other person, is not wrong. And I just find that whole thing really fascinating. I just, I don't know if it's right or wrong. It just simply is. But I think it would create some interesting discussion.
Can you talk more, Rosemary, about what you mean by psychological affair with your characters?
Yeah, so let's see. I have to do this in a way that I don't give away a lot of plot.
Yes, please. Yeah.
So I have to be really, really careful because I don't want to give too much of the novel away. All right. So one thing that I explore in this is a relationship with someone when one of the parties is absent. So the first instance of this, one of the lovers dies. And after he has died, so it's the man that dies, Justine, the Victorian character, after a while has, she has a sexual experience where she's imagining him. She self-pleasures in this experience, but she wouldn't have been doing this if he wasn't very, very powerfully in her mind. And this, again, it really interests me because you've got one person who's alive, another one who's dead, and yet there is still a union of sorts, which is happening with a physical reaction with the person who's still living. The psychology of it is key. So I would say that is a psychological relationship with a physical outcome. But if Justine didn't have a very vivid, strong imagination and spiritual ties and psychological ties to the person who has passed away, she wouldn't be able to do that. In the second instance, it's a physical separation. So she's the lover has not died; he's alive, and she writes. So she writes to him, and definitely the same thing. He is in her mind, and she's able to sort of have this relationship with this figment of her imagination. I think it's not just her imagination. I think that the person on the other end really, loves her. Like, we know that the other person loves her. But I suppose that's what I mean. And I'm actually really interested about that. But I think today, like, just in general, and you could use this for anything. It doesn't have to be for a love relationship or, a sexually explicit relationship. We're separated from people all the time, through death, through look at the last couple of years, like with COVID, right? I have family members living in other countries, and I've always had family members living in other countries. And the relationships are still there, but they've just shifted into another realm. And again, to move away slightly from, to move away a whole lot from the sexual component of this. I know that I'll talk about this moving forward as, hopefully, I'll get the opportunity to talk about the novel again, but the most formative, relationship of my life was with my paternal grandparents. And in reality, I only saw them once a year, but the relationship was so powerful. It was so strong. And people would scoff at it, but I could send thought messages to them. We practice sending thought messages. It doesn't matter, Atlantic Ocean, in the way, and we did this on purpose, like we would test ourselves. But the thing is that it was just, and there was no physical, there was physical contact when we were together, but the core relationship did not rely on physical presence. And you know, they've both been dead for many years, but I feel them all the time. I talk to them all the time. They have an influence in my life, and they're very much, you know, with me. And so I'm just fascinated by that. And in this particular case, I've shifted that to love relationships. And I'm just super interested in exploring it in terms of, you know, love and, you know, sex and, you know, other areas as well, not just in, you know, in this case, it was with my grandparents.
Thank you so much for sharing, Rosemary. And I know yesterday you were also talking about like when you were growing up and being around your grandparents and kind of knowing who you are, who you were growing up, and that you were very fascinated about love and your feminine side. Could you kind of share more about that and maybe how that kind of helped you write the sexual scenes now, or even just the overall book in general?
Well, that's really interesting. That's an interesting question.
Yeah.
Okay, so because for me there's like a lot of different aspects to that question. So I tend to chat a lot. So just like bear with me as I talk my way through that. First of all, with regards to this kind of writing, my grandparents died. Definitely, they were alive when I was writing. Like I've written all my life, right? So they always were very encouraging. And actually, I had just started my first novel. My grandmother was still alive. The first novel didn't have a lot of, you know, sex in it. But I can remember saying to my grandmother, I think maybe I will write this way. And, you know, you think of her generation, you know, sort of World War II, you know, she was like a World War II bride. So, you know, older generation, but very British and very forthright. And her reaction was, jolly good. You'll make lots of money. In other words, go for it. You know, so it was very, I don't know. I'm not setting out to make lots of money, but sex sells. So that was her. She's a very practical person. And she would hate me to say this, but she was always very, very comfortable in her own skin. And that I think was a really good example for me. I was more inhibited than my grandmother was. She also really encouraged or supported my ultra, you know, femininity. So yes, I could wear jewelry, I could wear makeup, I could wear high heels once I was, you know, when I was older and I wanted to wear high heels. In fact, when I was a little girl, I used to, you know, sort of topple all over the house in her high heels. And I think that that was just really positive for me as a young girl who wanted to celebrate her feminine side and her, you know, blossoming or budding feminine side, if you want to call it that. So you're going to have to remind me of what the original question was.
I think it was asking about how, I don't even remember anymore.
So you were asking me about my grandparents, and then you were asking me about
and like how that informs your writing these days, right?
Yeah, yeah, how it kind of I guess how your childhood inspired your writing was kind of what my question was. I was so into your answer. I was like, I don't remember what what it was.
This means it's a good talk. Well, I know what I was going to say. Okay, so one of the questions, for people who are listening, one of the questions that was asked to me, Erika or Kendra, I don't know who asked it when we were rehearsing for this, is how I get myself in the state of mind or the frame of mind to even write these things. And this is where I think the femininity piece comes in. So I'm going to have to answer that other question about how I get in the frame of mind to do this, to touch on the feminine thing. So I said when we had this discussion in the rehearsal that to get in this frame of mind, I have to have a clear mind, and I have to almost be in a meditative state for the scene to flow through me. And I was thinking about this today. I have always written in the morning. So if I'm going to write creatively, like not necessarily like articles and things like that, but if I'm going to write creatively for this story or any story, it's first thing in the morning. I give the story my first self. In other words, if I get up and then I start doing household tasks like dishes and laundry and stuff like that, then I'm not going to feel like writing scenes like that. And I was also thinking that I poke fun of that because in the story, I do have somebody who has a dishwashing fetish. So when they wash the dishes, this is sort of in the modern section, all that it gets them in the mood, right? But if I'm making fun because there is nothing more mind numbing than washing dishes, right? So for me, first thing in the morning, clear mind, can't, be thinking of other household tasks. And then sometimes I will listen to music and sometimes it'll be silent, but more often not music. And it's like this meditative, almost like the type of thing you'd listen to in yoga. It's music to calm my mind, to get myself in a meditative state. When that happens, the characters show up, and they really do show up like a little ensemble, kind of like gathering, like ready for the day. And a scene emerges, and I do have like an imagination. So like I do imagine myself backstage with them, and them all saying, well, are you going to write about me today? And no, we want to go on, we haven't been written about for a while. And I'm like, okay, I'll take you and you, so I do have that in me. But anyway, so if I'm in that state, then a scene will begin to flow through me, and it doesn't start with sex. It starts with something else. It could be a conversation, it could be an argument, it could be, and then I go with the flow of the characters. It really is like channeling. So they're coming to you. I hear bits and pieces of conversation and I'm trying to get it on the paper. And so there's that aspect to it. Where this comes into the feminine side is that I don't think, and again, I've been thinking since our practice the other day, I don't know if I could write this way if I didn't have a lot of sexual energy, right? So I do have this ultra feminine side to me, and I do use it, and I feel when I'm writing really free to use it. Like it's like when I am writing it, let's say it's on screen or on a piece of paper, like I don't feel, there is a little voice sometimes is, well, what's your family going to think of this? But I've been telling that little voice to shut up lately, so I can just like get on with it. But yeah, and I use that in these scenes, so does that come from my childhood? I don't know. I mean, I don't know, but I definitely know that this feminine, sexually charged side of me does come out in those scenes. Doesn't mean that in my real life, that I'm running around and having affairs or anything like that. But when I'm on paper, that side definitely comes out. And I let it go. I just, I kind of like let the characters go for it.
Yeah, that's awesome that you're able to, I guess, like express how you're feeling into your characters. Thank you for listening to part 1 of Sexuality with Rosemary and Kendra from The Girl on Harlow Street. And please look out next week for part 2 as we talk about the rest of our topics for sexuality.